Shit, hang on. Did you already start it?
We are live now. What's up, Flannelverse? What's up, Endgamers? We are back for Thursday Night Football. We've got the Buccaneers at the Falcons. Looking forward to this one. Welcome to Week 5. First game of Week 5 is here already. Man, time flies during NFL season. We're gonna go we're gonna go position by position on this stream. Take any questions that you have along the way. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all. A big milestone for me and the channel this week. As of Monday, hit 3,000 subscribers. So set the new goal to 5,000. Really appreciate all of you supporting the channel. Has been pretty awesome to see the growth this past month. And of course, if you're not already subscribed to the Flannelverse, trying to get to 5,000 now, but also if you're not already subscribed to the Endgame Syndicate channel, a lot of great stuff going on at Endgame Syndicate. Of course, you have Adam doing his breakdowns. He's been doing MLB all summer, doing NFL breakdowns on his channel as well now, and has plans for the NBA season. Do you want to tell people a little bit about your NBA plans, Adam?
Yeah, I'll just be on the Endgame channel doing the same tournament show that I did for baseball. Planning on doing that, running it back for NBA. I'm not planning on doing the same sort of other content that I did for baseball just because of how NBA is with time constraints, and I can't commit or promise to be updating projections for people at 6:55 before lock. But I do plan on still doing that show, probably like 5 p.m. time frame, give or take. Just looking through the lineups that I'd be playing in NBA if the slate did start then.
Nice. Okay. So yeah, check out the Endgame Syndicate channel. Make sure you are subscribed if you have not already done so. But yeah, really appreciate everybody's support. Adam, I didn't even pull it up. But you had another big day on Monday. So I feel like you've kind of been humbled this season a little bit. You came in Showdown, you're like, oh, I'm not that good at Showdown. Then you won a Showdown slate. Then you came in on Monday and you were like, oh, I don't like 2-game slates. I'm not really good at them. And then you won a lot of money on Monday. So things seem to be turning around for you in these slates that you don't think you're good at.
Yeah, still don't know if I'm good at them, but it's nice to at least run well. So that's nice. I guess I need to start saying that I'm not good on Sundays too.
Yeah, right. Just you just got to keep running it back. Just
Right.
Talk shit about yourself, and karma, I guess, is going to do things well for you. All right, we'll get into this, but I wanted to. I pulled up on the screen here. You can see Fantasy Points does adjust, updates this after week 4 of the season. Schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed per game. One of my favorite tools to use at Fantasy Points is updated as of October 1st. So we've just had it available for a couple of days now. So this is a new tool that we're going to start mixing in a little bit, that I'm going to start mixing in at least when I'm talking about, how defenses do against different positions. I think it's just a quick, kind of shorthand way to see in general, how has this defense done against running backs and how is it done against running backs through the passing game or the running game. Similar like quarterbacks via throwing it or running it. How is this defense doing against quarterbacks? I think it's kind of a cool shorthand tool for seeing how defenses do against the offense. So just wanted to pull this up here. I'll be using it throughout these shows going forward, but we will get into it position by position, starting with quarterbacks here. I guess I'll pull it up here. We have Baker Mayfield and Kirk Cousins. Baker Mayfield, the higher projected quarterback of the two of them, also 9,600. Kirk Cousins only 8,600. So nice price tag there on Kirk Cousins, but the projection kind of fits it. It projects over 2 fantasy points worse than Baker Mayfield. At captain, let's look at the captain ownership here. We have Baker Mayfield coming in at around 10% ownership. Kirk Cousins coming in around 6% ownership. So neither of them getting a ton of ownership at captain. Adam, how much are you getting to of these two quarterbacks?
Yeah, so I mean, they're both showing up as optimal a lot. They show up as the flex optimal for me, both a little bit above 50% of the time. They show up just shy of 10% in captain. I do have the projection on Mayfield and Cousins a little bit closer. So that does, Mayfield's still ahead of him, but not by a huge margin. So because of the cheaper price on Cousins, that does actually push him up a little bit. He's also projected for less ownership. So my guess, at least right now, with the way things look, is that I do end up probably being a little bit heavier on Cousins just because of the lower ownership, similar projection, better price tag. I think that the ownership coming into Mayfield is fine, but I think he's going a little bit overowned. Again, on the individual player level, that doesn't necessarily mean a ton, especially when you're talking about somebody that's still one of the most likely players to be an optimal play. But Cousins looks like he's going underowned to me, both at flex and slightly underowned at captain too. So I assume, at least with the way things look right now, that I end up pretty heavy on Cousins.
It is worth noting also, I read off the projections from Fantasy Points. It's actually much closer on Roto-Grindr, so more in line with what you have. I think Baker Mayfield projected for just under 18 fantasy points. Kirk Cousins projected for 17 fantasy points at Roto-Grindr, so much closer there as well. As far as how you are stacking them, to me, Kirk Cousins, you obviously are always stacking in every lineup, just has zero rushing upside, preferably multiple pass catching options in the captain spot. And then Baker Mayfield has actually scored 2 rushing touchdowns already this year after scoring 1 across 17 games last year. I think that's just kind of a fluke. He is averaging 16 rushing yards per game, so a little bit more than the 9 point something he was averaging last year. So rushing a little bit more this year. Still, I think kind of fluky. I generally want to be stacking up Baker Mayfield and having multiple pass catchers when he's in the captain spot. Adam, have you run your sims? Are you able to see like kind of how much you think you're stacking with these quarterbacks?
Yeah, I don't have an easy way to see like specific pass catchers with Cousins, but overall, where Cousins is captain, I am obviously stacking a lot. I'm just kind of like scrolling through the lineups, and it looks like a lot of 2 wide receiver teams. Also, just full Atlanta stacks. You can throw Robinson in there too. Individually with Cousins at captain, Drake London shows up in the optimal lineup 66% of the time. McLeod's in there 65%. Bijan's in there 61%. Then it drops off a little bit to Mooney at 38%. But not surprising that the top 4 guys that show up most often in lineups where Cousins is the captain are his teammates.
Yep, makes sense. So yeah, and the ownership seems, actually I didn't even look at the ownership on in the flex. So let's take a look at the and I did. All right, flex ownership on Baker coming in around 45%, Cousins around 37%. Both seem fine to me. Not like numbers that I'm going to take a big stand on. Kind of how it usually is with quarterbacks. They're getting a fair amount of ownership. They're not getting like 90% ownership. Kind of seems like fair numbers, not taking a big stand there. So the biggest thing that I'm always just worried about with quarterbacks is making sure I am correlating correctly. So yeah, that would be my note. You want multiple pass catchers if you have either of these quarterbacks in the captain spot in general, and if you have them in the flex, you probably want to have at least one pass catcher with each of them. A lot of comments on your hat, Adam. A lot of comments on the Orioles. Are they out now?
Yes, they are.
Sorry for your team's loss. How are you doing with her? Are you coping okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. I mean, it's baseball. Like, it's a best of 3 series. It's like flipping a coin, but it sucks. Like, they scored 1 run in the series. They got swept last year. Like, yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, that does suck. After they were such an exciting team all year, to just that's
the really annoying part is just like the fans though, because like, and I get it. Like, I tweeted about it yesterday, but like, obviously the sport would be less fun if fans in general like had the same viewpoint that I do, where it's just like random in the playoffs.
Right.
But like, it's really annoying how it's just like, why didn't they hit better? Like, they choked, like blah blah. It's like it was one game against a major league pitcher, 2 games against a major league pitcher. Like, that's why they didn't hit better.
It happens in the middle of the season plenty,
right,
also, but people only notice it in the playoffs. And yeah, it's like, come on, people. Yeah, that's that is true. It is fun the way people overreact. Like, it makes it more enjoyable, but also it's so annoying. Similar to like week 1 overreactions in like best ball, like just like everybody taking victory laps, taking L's immediately, just like majorly overreacting. Yeah, it's kind of the same thing, where it's like, on the one hand, I'm like, you guys are ridiculous, and on the other hand, I kind of enjoy that people are ridiculous.
Right.
It also helps.
Yeah, it would be a lot more boring if everybody just had a very measured approach and was just like, on to next year.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I think we've said all we need to say. Actually, I should pull up fantasy points allowed. So I brought up this metric. Might as well touch on it real quick. For each of these quarterbacks, we have Tampa Bay has allowed, what is this, like the 8th most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks on the year. But it is worth noting that they've actually allowed fewer than average against the pass and more than average against the run. So it doesn't really benefit Kirk Cousins. So not the best matchup, I would say, for Kirk Cousins based on this metric. Now, of course, this is, I do want to say, even though I like this metric, it's very much just a kind of catch-all shorthand thing. It's not going to be perfect. It's all based on small sample sizes. It's trying to capture like the matchups that these teams have had, but it's tough to do on a short sample. So I think this gets better and better throughout the year. I don't want to read too much into it, but based on schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, tough matchup for Kirk Cousins. And then Atlanta has been Also negative against the pass, a little bit better against has been worse against the run. So better for rushing quarterbacks, not great for throwing quarterbacks in general. So not the best matchup for Baker Mayfield either. But there are going to be parts of the passing game that I think we can exploit that we'll get to as we move on to other positions. All right, let's move on to running backs. I'll pull this up here. All right, so at the running back position, obviously it all starts with Bijan Robinson at the top. Projects the best, he is 9,800. And I'll actually pull up schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed right away, because I think this is pretty interesting with Bijan against Tampa. So overall, Tampa has been, a plus matchup for running backs, and particularly good for running backs through the air, allowing 5.3 fantasy points more than you would expect through the air to running backs. It's been worse against the run. So kind of an interesting matchup here for Bijan. I think it could be one where it sets up for a lot of pass catching there. Adam, how much are you getting to Bijan in your lineups?
So I'm getting to him a lot. Like, he's obviously one of the most likely guys to be in the optimal lineup. I have him projected as the highest scorer on the slate. I do think he's going pretty overowned. Obviously we've seen Tyler Algier continue to play a big role, both, in the red zone and just in general. So you do have just that extra volatility at the position where, Robinson's not guaranteed to get the most valuable touches, especially if Algier is playing well. So, that is a downside when you're talking about a really, really popular player that's also really expensive. But goes without saying that he's also one of the best plays on the slate because he is Bijan Robinson. I think he's obviously good, but it's also a matter of, finding lineups that, if you do think he's overowned like I do, find how many lineups can you find that still on a lineup level look like good lineups to play that have him in them.
Yep. I like that breakdown. Bijan coming in at 16% projected ownership in the captain spot. You kind of gave the one reason you like to have running back sometimes in the captain spot is they don't, kind of funnel you to a specific build with the rest of your lineup quite the same way you do with, definitely quarterbacks, to a lesser extent wide receivers, but running backs kind of like you can play them in there and then just do whatever you want with the rest of your lineup. Doesn't really correlate that much anywhere. 43% projected ownership for Bijan in the flex as well. So yeah, getting a fair amount of ownership. I think I actually like it. I'm going to lean into, I think I'll probably be over 16% Bijan in the captain spot. Just love the spot there. And also one other thing that I want to point out. So I brought up the fantasy points allowed, and it's not as good of a matchup on the ground for Bijan as it is through the air. My friend Fantasy Guru Drew pointed out last night that in terms of stuff rate, both the Bucs and the Falcons are bottom 3 in the league in terms of the amount that they're able to stuff opposing running backs. So by this metric, these would look like two of the worst run defenses in the league. So it hasn't really come to fruition in actual fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs, but maybe some hope that this could be a game where both running games are able to have some success. It could be that they're actually not that good based on, looking at their stuff rate. They just happen to have not allowed that many fantasy points, which obviously can be pretty fluky. We saw on Monday night, Kenneth Walker ended up looking really good, but early on he had 2 touchdowns when he was averaging 3.6 yards per carry. So it was looking kind of fluky. That can just happen sometimes, the way running backs score fantasy points. I should also know when I talk about the, yards per carry when he has 2 touchdowns, that they're also both short touchdowns. That's going to shorten your yards per carry when you're scoring 1-yard touchdowns. So, maybe he was doing better than I thought, but he didn't look like he was crushing early on in the game.
He wasn't doing anything.
Yeah, and still had a lot of fantasy points. So that can happen. The actual fantasy points allowed can be misleading.
Yeah. And to your point, also in adjusted yards before contact, Atlanta allowing the 11th most yards before contact, Tampa Bay allowing the 13th most. So, not horrible in that metric, but certainly not a great job either.
Yeah. Oh, this is a good point, actually. Alan brought up B-Rob hamstring issue. Yeah, and that is something I've heard little rumblings about. Bijan a little bit banged up. I think he's a full go. I don't think he's even questionable for this game. But that is, I guess, one more reason to think about if you are thinking about fading Bijan. Obviously, a hamstring, you always have re-injury risk. How much do you factor something like that in, Adam, when a player's not even questionable? He's a full go for the game, but there have been rumblings. Actually, let me see what the latest rumblings are on Bijan's hamstring. But how much do you try to factor that in when a player is a full go, but also like, he's been a little bit banged up?
I typically don't. I just don't really have any way to do it. Like if he's questionable with a hamstring injury or something, but plays, even then, I'm generally gonna just assume he's a full go. But like, you can dial back the projected workload a little bit, especially in a case like this where they have Tyler Algier that that they're happy to use. But in a case where it's just like he doesn't have any sort of designation and people are speculating, like I'm not gonna do anything about it.
Yeah, and I'm just pulling up to confirm that. Yeah, Tom Pelissero yesterday, he's off the injury report entirely. Was limited on early in the week, probably just Monday with the hamstring injury. But yeah, I guess there would be cases where maybe if the RB2 was getting like zero ownership, I would be like, all right, this is a reason for me to play more of that RB2. That's not the case here. So Tyler Algier being the other running back on the Falcons, and I'll pull up his projected ownership in the flex. We have Algier coming in at 24% projected ownership, and he's 4.8K. It is theoretically, I think, a positive for Algier that Bijan maybe has had his hamstring tingling a little bit. Maybe that does mean there's more re-injury risk, but at this kind of ownership, it's harder for me to like get excited about it.
Right. Yeah. Like a good example, I think, is I had told you on Monday in the Seahawks-Lions game. You had Kenneth Walker coming back from injury. The entire industry was projecting him for his normal, like 60% market share or whatever. And I was like, okay, what if they just split carries in his first game back between him and Charbonnet? And so I still didn't project them to actually split, but I did project Charbonnet a little bit higher and cut a little bit from Walker. Obviously, it didn't work out. Walker smashed, but that was a spot where like Charbonnet was just getting like no ownership on Showdown. And it was like, okay, like this could just be a much different situation than everybody's projecting it to be here, unless you're going to just say, I think because of some hamstring injury that may or may not exist, Tyler Algier is the number one running back. I don't really know that you can, because like he's getting ownership anyway. He's a fine play anyway. So I don't really know what you can do about it.
Yeah, exactly. Want to touch on just a couple comments real quick. First of all, Matt says, "Hell yeah, I didn't realize you guys are doing this Showdown Shaman back at it." Yeah, it's been cool. Every stream that I do seems like more people are finding the channel. So maybe I need to get better at advertising this channel outside of just like streaming to Twitter. I tweet it out once per game, once per day, but I forget, not everybody is as online as I am. So, I think you're similar to me. I think we're always hesitant to like, I don't really want to bombard people with all of my links and content all the time, but also like for other people who don't live on Twitter, they're not seeing it all the time. I don't know. That's always
it's really counterintuitive too. Like, especially in my case, like I have no issue bombarding people with just like moronic takes all throughout the day and night.
Yeah.
But then I like hesitate to actually promote the useful things that I'm doing.
Yeah, exactly. It's but glad you guys are finding the channel throughout the season. And then I also wanted to touch on this one. Jose says, can you break down your game script, how you see this game playing out? I don't like to do that like in general, because first of all, I don't think that's my strength. It's like predicting how a game is actually going to turn out. But we've talked about it before, Adam, where it's like I try to make lineups that correlate well and make sense, but I'm going to have a mix of different types of lineups throughout, my lineup set. So it's, I don't know. I don't know that I see a ton of use in trying to figure out exactly how the game is going to play out. Maybe there are certain slates where like I want to, because I think trying to play it through a different type of play out than the field. If the field is all assuming, like, oh, this is going to be a 65-point game or something like that, then maybe that would be a case. If I see reasons for that not to be the case, then I'll try to lean into that some. But in general, when I don't have like a great read on how I think a game is going to play out, I don't spend as much time trying to figure it out. I just try to correlate for like different types of outcomes. And I would say a lot of lineups can work in multiple different types of outcomes. Like the same lineup that could be like this game is a shootout. It's going to score a lot of points. So all these guys, all these offensive players are going to score a ton of fantasy points. That can be the same lineup can be good for that type of structure as it's going to be a low scoring game. These guys are going to be, score a lot of PPR fantasy points and get into the winning lineup. So I don't know. I don't like to spend a lot of time on it. It's not, you're not in your head. I think we're on the same page.
Yeah, it's just not part of my process for a couple of reasons. Like one, we talked about this the other day, I think on Monday, with the 2-game slate. Like I don't really spend any time trying to predict what's going to happen outside of, like projections and stuff.
Yeah.
Because there is just so much volatility and everything, but it all just comes back to like building lineups that are going to make you the most money when they do come to fruition. And usually those aren't going to be the lineups that are the most likely to occur, because usually everybody's pretty in alignment. Everybody is looking at the same Vegas totals. They're pretty in alignment on what the most likely thing to happen is. So there's that. And then also, as long as you're using correlation in the lineups that you're building, and this is a spot where using sims is more advantageous than using optimizers, you don't have to think about it as much, because in the lineups I'm building, it's automatically accounting for when Kirk Cousins does well, Drake London is more likely to do well. So that's basically handling the game script aspect. If you're using an optimizer, you do probably want to put at least a little bit of thought into it, but not necessarily in the sense of how do I think the game's going to break out, but more like Chase Harrell said in chat, each lineup tells the story you're going for. Putting some thought into it, like make sure that when you're building with an optimizer that has no idea what correlations are, that you're frequently getting a stacking partner or two, with Kirk Cousins, for example. But outside of that, I don't really spend any time on it.
Yeah. And that's like, I'll force those correlations in an optimizer with like the quarterback and the pass catching options. You can do like boosts on certain players. But I don't spend a ton of time thinking about it. On this slate, I do have to write up a game script that I like to build for in the Roto Runners expert survey. So I did write that up, and I think I said I like the idea of a low scoring game where both teams kind of keep it on the ground. The running backs go. So if you want to build one type of structure that I think could be like a little bit underutilized, it's not like I'm not like predicting this is the way I think it could go, but I think it's kind of a fun way to build is like build through the running games. I like the idea of playing Bijan on the one side, maybe both Rashad White and Bucky Irving. I think you can play them together. That could be kind of unique. And then just like the PPR scam guys. So like Chris Godwin, we'll get into the receivers, but Chris Godwin has the better matchup of the receivers on the Bucs, for example, could just score a lot of PPR points. So like even in a low scoring game, could put up a lot of fantasy points. And of course, all those players could also do well in a very high scoring game. So that's one way I'm building, is just like, could be a low scoring game. These guys are good, going to score PPR points. Bucky Irving, cheap enough, if they keep it on the ground, will score fantasy points. So I guess there's one way to build that I think could be a plus EV way to build, at least.
And then the other thing too, and I think you mentioned it, but the other problem you run into with the whole like game script and building a lineup that tells the story thing is you're more likely to be duped the more your lineup makes sense from a narrative standpoint. So like there is also it is one football game and random stuff can happen, even if it's, no matter what the game script is, something random can happen where somebody that doesn't really make sense in that game script still gets there. So like, and then there's the added benefit of like your lineup isn't duplicated as much if it doesn't really make sense. So that's another consideration.
And like the most obvious one always being like quarterback at captain with the opposing defense in the flex. Like intuitively, it's like, well, if you have the quarterback at captain, you're assuming the quarterback is dominating the game. The defense can't stop him. Well, why would you want the defense in that lineup? And then it's like, well, just one random pick six. Like maybe it's not even the quarterback's fault. Something goes wrong. They get a pick six. Suddenly you want the opposing defense. Just like a lot of ways for different types of lineups to work out. All right. So we touched on Tyler Algier just a little bit. What is your level of interest? 4,800, getting 24% projected ownership in the flex. Obviously has the additional out of maybe Bijan gets hurt, has that contingent upside, has obviously some standalone value as we saw last week. What is your level of interest in Tyler Algier?
Pretty neutral. I have the field at like 17% flex, 2% captain. I have him optimal at flex like 15% of the time, optimal at captain a little shy of 2% of the time. So I think he's going a little bit over owned, but more or less in line with the field. I think he's a pretty solid value play at 4,800. You do have plenty of quality plays in that range on this slate, which does, I think, keep both his ownership in check and his optimal percentage relatively low. There would be a lot of slates where 4,800 for him really stands out, but on this one where you do have the kickers and the defenses, but you also have like Kate Otten in there. You have, Bucky Irving's more expensive, I guess, but you do have other guys in this price range that he's competing with too.
Yep. I will say, and you alluded to this earlier, saw his best usage of the year last week, had 8 carries on 41% snap share. So he was playing a lot, got 8 carries, also saw 2 targets on 33% route participation. So the route participation, his best of the season so far, the targets the most of the season. So was a little bit more involved in that game. I think I read some coach's quotes basically saying, they're playing not a hand. He was looking good out there. They didn't have any reason to put Bijan in there in that game script. So I don't think it's necessarily sticky, but at least maybe promising that they can if he is the hot hand. That's something I kind of wasn't buying. They said throughout the summer, like, there will be games where Tyler Algier, we're going to lean on Tyler Algier more. He's going to get usage. And I was like, why would they use him over Bijan? But turns out it's real. Turns out it is real. There are game scripts where they will lean on Tyler Algier a little bit more. So I think I'm going to be a little bit light on Algier. The ownership is so high for, like, I do think, obviously this is within his range of outcomes, 8 carries and 2 targets at 4,800. If I knew he was going to have this, and this is his best game as far as usage goes, I don't know how much I think I would probably want to be to short 24% if I knew this was going to be his usage. And I think this is just like, he got more usage because he was doing well in that game. So I don't know. I don't totally hate it, I guess. It is, if you do want to play that game script where you're leaning into the run game. How do you feel about, I don't know if you can see, how much do you get of Algier when you have Bijan at captain or vice versa, or just like, how much do you think you have them together?
So in the lineups where Bijan is the optimal captain, I have Algier in 23% of those lineups, which is like, I don't know, probably 10th most, something like that.
It's kind of a lot. I mean,
yeah. So like he's in there, but he's behind Cousins, Godwin, Mayfield, McLeod, White, Mooney, London, Evans, Falcons defense, Irving, Otten. Then it's Algier.
Yeah, but 23% is that's not nothing. So yeah, it just goes to show you can play the running backs together. I assume that will be the case for the Bucs also. And do you have anything else you want to say about the Falcons running backs?
I just looked. Obviously, Algier at captain not going to occur as often, but Bijan's in 36% of those lineups.
Okay. So yeah, just, Algier kind of allows you to pay up for the better pay up options, and Bijan obviously one of those.
And I mean, one thing with Algier is, like you were saying, his workload obviously is going to vary by game. He does have they will use him in the red zone. So that is nice, is even if his workload, as far as like a market share standpoint, isn't as high as it was last week or as you would like, if he gets the right touches, he can still just get there at 4,800.
True. Yeah, just like Kenneth Walker last week, where it's like, if he just has 2 goal line carries, and he's perfectly capable of getting 2 goal line carries. That is a good point, that he can get there without crazy good volume. As far as Tampa Bay goes, also kind of just two that I'm interested in, Rachaad White and Bucky Irving. Can pull up the last week what we had here. Each had 10 carries, so kind of interesting to see Bucky Irving match White in carries, and that's kind of something the coaches have been talking about. Like, we need to get both these guys involved. Todd Bowles actually said this week, like, we could get them involved at the same time, like have them both in the game at the same time. So it kind of seems like things trending in the right direction for Bucky Irving here. We can start with Rachaad White, though. More involved in the passing game last week, 46% route participation, 3 targets for Rachaad White. You can see he's had a couple games with 6 targets on the year. What's your level of interest in Rachaad White?
I think he looks fine. I am concerned, like, how quickly does Bucky Irving just kind of overtake him? Rachaad White has not been an efficient runner ever, and it seems like the Bucs are, the whole best ball stand on Bucky Irving was like, by the end of the season, maybe he's the starting running back in Tampa, and Tampa seems to be pretty aggressively moving towards that early in the season.
Yeah.
And Irving's had a role as a pass catcher too. Like, he ran 13 routes last week to 23 for Rachaad White. So I think that the logical assumption has been that, like, Bucky Irving is going to start taking more early down work, but Rachaad White will still be the primary pass catching back, which I think is the most likely case, but it's not a guarantee. Like, you could just get Bucky Irving overtaking Rachaad White sooner than later, which obviously you wouldn't want Rachaad White in those games. But the most likely case today, I think, is still that you see them pretty much splitting carries and then White having the edge as a pass catching back. So I do think White projects a little bit higher than Irving just because of the passing game role and it being full PPR. So I think he looks fine. I think that he's going maybe a little bit under-owned. But again, there is just a lot of additional volatility right now in the way that you project this backfield, because we don't know how quickly it's just going to continue moving toward Bucky Irving.
Yeah, and it's at least promising for Rachaad White that the coaches, I feel like they go back and forth with their coach speak. Like, sometimes like, oh, we got to get Bucky Irving the ball more. Kind of, there have been some rumblings that, like, he was like clearly going to be the lead back, and then the coaches keep pushing back and be like, no, we like both these guys. They're both doing great. We want to get them both involved. So I think I have the same read on it as you, where, yeah, I think it's going to be largely a split. Probably Rachaad White more involved in the passing game, just because Bucky Irving's too small to pass block. So I think Rachaad White's just going to be out there more on
He's
passing
actually
plays.
supposedly good at pass blocking.
Is he really?
Yeah.
Like, since he was been in the NFL, so just like the 4-game sample size, or do you mean like going back to college
scouting
days?
report wise? I'm almost positive.
Interesting. I thought I had heard otherwise, that like he was not going to be in on, but I mean, I believe you. That's just I have not looked at the actual scouting reports that closely on Bucky Irving. Just kind of rumblings I had heard was he's going to have trouble getting out there on passing downs because he's too small. But interesting. So maybe he does overtake that passing down role over time a little bit more. Looking at this, you can see it's negative across the board matchup for Tampa Bay against this Atlanta defense. Again, though, bottom 3 in the league in stuff rate. So maybe that's just a small sample size thing. Maybe over time going to be a better matchup for running backs. I'm kind of leaning into it. I kind of like the idea of playing both running backs. And as I said, both in the same lineup, perfectly happy with. Let me see the flex ownership here. We have Rachaad White at 23.5% flex ownership. That's a really nice number to me. I like Rachaad White quite a bit. Bucky Irving, 23% flex ownership. Interesting. Wait, is Bucky Irving 6.4K? I didn't realize it was this close in price.
Yeah, they're like the same salary.
Okay. Yeah. I had thought that it was Bucky Irving. Maybe I think I had his salary the same as Tyler Algier in my head. So that's kind of interesting. I prefer Rachaad White just because he has shown more of that passing game. It seems like they're more comfortable with him in the passing game. If the ownership's going to be the same, I'll just lean into Rachaad White more. But yeah, I think Bucky Irving very much in play. Definitely can play the two of them together. And then at captain, we have Rachaad White at 4% captain ownership. I really like that. I think I'm going to lean into Rachaad White at captain quite a bit just because he does have that passing game role more. I'll also have some Bucky Irving. How do you feel about the two of them at captain?
Yeah, so I think White showing up captain optimal like 7% of the time for me. Irving showing up at about 5%. And again, that makes sense just given that I do have a higher projection on White since I do expect him to be more involved in the passing game. So that makes him look a little bit under-owned at captain, having projected for like 6% ownership. So nothing too crazy there. And then pretty much correct captain ownership for Irving too, between 4 and 5%. So I do think they both make sense. Obviously in Irving's case, you're just hoping he happens to get into the end zone, but and they did use him around the goal line last week too, which I think was interesting because like I think there's this narrative with like he's not big, but I think there's a narrative with him that like he's a lot smaller than he is. He was a 3-down back in college. He like they used him around the goal line last week. He's not like Darren Sproles or something. So yeah. I thought that was interesting, but obviously he could take on a bigger pass catching workload. And if you're playing him captain, you're hoping that's the case. White, you're just kind of hoping that even if he plays his normal role where he's splitting carries, that he's just involved. Also, for whatever it's worth, which isn't a lot, I pulled up the PFF pass blocking grades. Much smaller sample, obviously, for Irving than White, but they've graded out very similarly this year.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe the coaches at some point give him more of that passing game role. But yeah, I think it's reasonable to assume, at least for this game, until we see it, like it's been Rachaad White more involved in the passing game so far. Probably feels safe to project that. But I like both of them quite a bit. Based on the Roto Grinders projected ownership in the captain spot, both are actually looking under-owned relative to your optimal rate. So I think I'm going to lean into both at captain, honestly, at flex. Also, I really like this Bucs passing game in general today with the lean toward Rachaad White just because of the passing game involvement and the ownership being pretty similar between the two of them. I think that is all I need to say about running backs. Anything else you want to say about the Bucs running backs?
No, I was just looking to see who shows up most with them when they're captain. I don't see any like glaring differences. Baker's the most common flex guy for both of them. Which certainly makes sense for White, and for Irving, I think it's fine also. London, Robinson, Godwin, the next three for Irving. For White, the next three are Robinson, Cousins, London, and then Godwin. So yeah, pretty similar. Nothing that like stands out as far as treating them really differently if you're playing one at captain instead of the other.
And you are getting lineups with both of them in there with one of them a captain, like with the other one also making the lineup, or no?
Yeah, pretty similar split to Robinson and Algier. With White at captain, Irving shows up 23% of the time. With Irving at captain, White shows up 41% of the time. I think that does make sense, like just logically, where if Bucky Irving is your captain, White can still get there just because of PPR. Whereas, he's going to get there more often because of PPR. Whereas when White's your captain, Irving to get there most likely needs touchdowns, which obviously like cuts into White as your captain.
Right.
So I think it does make sense where you should, they're fine together either way, but you should be more willing to go White at flex when you have Irving at captain than Irving at flex when you have White at captain.
Yep. Good note. All right, let's move on and talk about wide receivers. Here we go. Move this down. I think it's going to start with Chris Godwin at the top as the top projected wide receiver by a little bit. He's 10,000, projects for 17.6 fantasy points. I will note that this is one place where schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed is pretty interesting, because you look at overall the matchup against Atlanta is a plus matchup. They are ranked, I think, 7th in the league in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers overall. But then you can break it down a little bit further, and in the slot, it's actually the best matchup in the league. And Chris Godwin, 65% from the slot so far this year. Now, again, don't know how much we want to be factoring this in, but it would kind of make sense. AJ Terrell out there guarding receivers out wide. It's been a tougher matchup for receivers lining up out wide than in the slot in general against Atlanta here. So Chris Godwin projecting a little bit better around the industry, has also just been better so far this year than Mike Evans. I don't know. I struggle with it a little bit, because I often just like, okay, if everybody's going to play Chris Godwin, I'd rather play Mike Evans, but the matchup clearly seems to favor Chris Godwin. What are you doing with Godwin and Evans to start here?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is just interesting is I assume Chris Godwin's going to be more popular, and he's projected to be more popular. Cody Main tweeted yesterday that we have 14 showdown slates where Godwin and Evans have played, and they have like identical ownership, which, again, I assume that this year is different. Godwin's been really good. He's running hot on touchdowns. He also is playing a role in general that is more favorable to him, running the vast majority of his routes out of the slot. So I assume he's going to get more ownership here, but I do wonder if that just ends up being a situation where everybody makes that assumption and then they click Mike Evans and it just kind of ends up balancing out again. But with the ownership, projected for Godwin to be more popular, I do think Godwin's going a little bit over-owned, whereas I think Evans at flex is pretty much correct, and I do think Evans is going under-owned at captain. But that being said, I still obviously think Godwin's a really good play. Full point PPR, he's going to look really good. Continuing to run a ton of routes from the slot, ran 69% last week. That's a big thing for him. It's something that had been talked about coming into the season, was a huge positive, that they were probably going to use him that way. Now, maybe the slot participation goes down a little bit this week with their injuries, but last week still you didn't have McMillan, and he still ran most of his routes from the slot. Sterling Shepard only ran 4 routes from the slot last week. He ran 24 out wide. So I assume that they're going to keep Godwin primarily in the slot, which, of course, is good for him. So I like him a lot. The Evans thing at captain going a little bit under-owned, I think does make sense, just because Evans, not that he can't get there on receptions, but generally when he has the big fantasy games, it's touchdowns. And so, it does make sense for him to kind of just be like a decent flex play, but then kind of stand out as a captain where, he's just kind of more boom or bust than Godwin is, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking too. It's just like, we know that Mike Evans has always been kind of a boom bust kind of play. He's also the kind of like, maybe I'm wrong about this. Like in my head, he's the type of like those bigger receivers. It's just like he can do it against anybody. It doesn't really matter what the matchup is. Like how many people can actually match up with Mike Evans. Right. Whereas there are some receivers where it's just like, yeah, they're not quite as physically imposing. Then I'm like, oh yeah, this great cover corner will be able to cover him better. I might be totally wrong about that being a thing, that it's easier for a beast of a wide receiver to overcome a tough matchup. But that's at least in theory, in my head, that seems to intuitively make sense.
Yeah, well, he's really big, but he's also really good is the thing too. It's not like it's not like he's just one of these 6'6" guys that they'll throw him jump balls and sometimes he'll get, like, he's a very good receiver too. So you have the size, and then you also just have the talent level where he can still win out regardless.
Yeah, exactly. Appreciate you, Tim, for reminding everybody. Yeah, please do hit the like button if you have not already done so. Subscribe to both of our YouTube channels as we are trying to grow them here. And I'm using the fantasy points tools. I need to say it at least once per show. If you use promo code Flannelman, you can get any fantasy points tool for 25% off. You can get access to the data suite for 25% off. You can get the all-in data suite with all of the content, all of that as well. So check out the fantasy points different packages here, 25% off all of them. Rotogrinders, I also get $10 off any package, the NFL package, if you want that. The link is in the description. You can get access to this lineup HQ, the optimizer I'm using here. So check that out if you are looking for an opto as well. Okay. So I think we are largely on the same page with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. I think I like, actually, I'll take that back. I think I like Godwin a little bit better than you do. I think that we're on the same page for sure on Mike Evans being under-owned here because he is in the captain spot in particular, because he is such a boom bust player that we just know he has the capability of scoring 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. At 12.5% ownership, I think I would actually be overweight to that on Chris Godwin. Just lean into his usage so far this year. This matchup for Chris Godwin, I think I like that number for Chris Godwin being a little bit on top of that. Do you think about how much are you getting of Chris Godwin at captain? Are you coming in about even with the field?
I have his optimal percentage at about 12%, so it's not like drastically on their own. It's similar, like I guess to clarify, because I said the same thing about Bijan also, that I thought he was going over owned. Bijan's still the most optimal captain for me, and Godwin is third. Drake London is in between them. I think he's going a little bit under owned, but yeah, I don't want it to come off to like I don't think Godwin's one of the most likely plays to succeed. And so, like I was saying with Bijan too, you know, on a player level, I think he's a little bit over owned, but I'm still assuming I'm going to have plenty of him because he's one of the most likely guys to succeed.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you're going to be playing them anyway, even if they are a little bit over owned according to your Sabre results. Marco asks, who's in the flex when Evans is in the captain spot for you?
Yeah, 80.5% Baker Mayfield, which makes a ton of sense. And then it's pretty, you know, spread out, but like Ray McLeod is second, which is a pricing thing, I'm sure. And then obviously, you know, there is some correlation between Evans and McLeod. Bijan, Cousins, White, London, those are all the guys above 30%. But yeah, it's Baker 80+% of the time. Then it drops off to 55% McLeod, and then everybody else is sub 50%. So there's nobody outside of Baker that is just like a very clear, like you want this guy with Mike Evans.
Yeah, very, very obvious correlation there. I'm curious how much, and we'll get to Sterling Shepard, but just for thinking this through, I'm curious how much you're getting to overall of Sterling Shepard.
So one other thing I was just going to say for context, when Chris Godwin's captain, Mayfield's in there 74% of the time. So like obviously you want Mayfield with Godwin too, but it does make sense that he's a little bit more aligned with Mike Evans just because of how they score their points. For Sterling Shepard, 1,600. I have him showing up optimal about 15% of the time, projected for about 15% ownership. I think the field's pretty much just got it right.
And is that about how much you have in your lineups also? I guess.
Yeah, 15% projected ownership, 14.5% chance of being optimal for Shepard.
Okay. I was only asking because I was wondering if like you have a similar amount of Shepard to Ray McLeod, but you're getting less of Shepard in your Mike Evans lineups, which just sort of an interesting thing, because I always think about like if I have Mike Evans in the captain spot, how many other Bucs receivers would I be willing to play in the flex? And I think with somebody like Sterling Shepard, it's not as big of a deal because he's 1,600, so maybe more willing to do it. But I was just thinking through like, are you getting Ray McLeod because he's on the opposing team, so he's not going to cut into Mike Evans at all? Is that maybe factored into it? But it sounds like it's just because you're getting less in general of Sterling Shepard.
It's because my projection on McLeod's like 2x Shepard. Like McLeod showing up optimal in flex like 39% of the time for me, Shepard 15. So like I would just expect McLeod to be showing up a lot more, and then Shepard probably just pretty much showing up when like I can't find $1,600 to get to McLeod.
All right, so we went through Godwin and Evans. We have Jalen McMillan is out, and also Trey Palmer out for this game. So we're missing two receivers for the Bucs, and actually it looks like Trey Palmer is still in here. So let's pull up Rotogrinders, take a look at how the ownership is shaking out there. But the general assumption we can probably make is that Sterling Shepard is going to step into that wide receiver 3 role. We kind of saw it last week with Jalen McMillan out there. So Sterling Shepard, kind of the one that we're expecting everybody to lean into, projected for 11% ownership. I've been kind of assuming that Sterling Shepard's ownership is going to come up to like 25% or something today. Has not been the case so far.
I don't know that it will because of McLeod.
That's a good point. Yeah, McLeod, being, what is he, 3,600 still?
3,400.
3,400. Yeah, that does make sense that maybe he would keep the ownership down on Shepard a little bit.
Like right now, the ownership projection I have for McLeod is 30%. I think that actually comes up before the 15% on Shepard comes up.
Interesting.
Because, and the reason I say that is that McLeod showing up is optimal, like 39% for me. That's the biggest gap on the slate right now in optimal percentage versus projected ownership for me is Ray McLeod being the most under-owned at flex. Usually when something like that pops up, especially early in the day, it's an indication that the field is just like the player is going to be more popular than he's being projected for. Whereas Shepard, the optimal percentage is like identical almost to his projected ownership.
Yeah, so it seems about right there for Shepard. Interesting thing here. So Rotogranus has Cody Thompson actually projected. I guess it's pretty comparable, but Cody Thompson over Cameron Johnson, and projected for a little bit more ownership. I guess I've been working under the assumption that Cameron Johnson is the more likely wide receiver for Cody Thompson. Probably going to be brought up from the practice squad. I think we'll know in a few hours here whether he actually gets called up from the practice squad, but it's sort of difficult to know who is likely to be the wide receiver 4 versus 5. So I think we pretty clearly have Shepard as the wide receiver 3 here. I don't know if you've given any thought to this particular breakdown, Adam, the Cameron Johnson versus Cody Thompson. Best I can do is pull up the participation from last week, give you kind of, I guess we had Cameron Johnson active last week. Yeah. So I guess that's kind of why I've been assuming he would be the wide receiver 4 here.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't project Thompson for anything yet. When he's called up, that'll change. But like, my assumption is Johnson. He ran 9 routes last week. Shepard ran 28. But outside of, Evans, Godwin, Shepard, Johnson ran the most routes.
Yep. And Cameron Johnson, I didn't know who he was prior to last night, but I looked him up. Seems he's a speedy rookie. Could be kind of a splash play. I think Cameron Johnson to me is kind of interesting. How much Cameron Johnson are you getting to?
Like 2%, which is where I've been projected for ownership too. And just to clarify, because I've seen people kind of mentioning it in chat or asking in chat. I'm telling you how often I think these guys are optimal. I haven't built lineups yet or looked at all at like what I'm likely to be playing percentage wise. So do keep that in mind. Like if I, say 39% Ray McLeod, that's just how often he's showing up in the optimal lineup for me, not how much I would expect to have of him if the slate started right now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good note. Got a question. How many routes is McLeod participating in? A lot. Let's see. For the season, we have Ray McLeod at 79.4%, third on the team, ahead of Kyle Pitts. I think it was even more early on in the year. I guess we can look at the breakdown here.
Well, week 1 was the weird one where McLeod didn't run that many routes. I think he
you're right,
50% of routes, but he led the team in targets.
Yep.
And then after that, he just started running routes constantly.
Yeah, 80.6% last week for McLeod. Week 2 was 93.5%. Yeah, you're right. It was just week 1 was kind of the outlier, and then they decided Ray McLeod is our guy. He's just so much better than Kyle Pitts. We need this guy out there on the field at all times. So yeah, he's been running a ton of routes the past few weeks. So you're not taking a big stand on Cameron Johnson. It sounds like.
No, I mean, like I think he's fine. He's $200 or whatever. So. Clearly, I expect him to be on the field enough that $200 is worth, taking a shot at. But obviously, you're not expecting anything out of him. Like his median projection is, sub 2 points. But yeah, it's kind of like Jalen Hyatt the other day at 600, I guess. Like Hyatt, I think was more clearly going to get at least a target. Right. But kind of the same thing where like most likely you're taking a 0 or you're getting a very low score. But it doesn't really take him doing much for him to be optimal, especially on a slate where you do have, Godwin, Evans, Robinson at the top. Like it's not hard to envision a slate where those guys all just do what they're capable of doing. And then any amount of production from a $200 guy becomes really useful.
Yeah. And so it's an interesting slate in that we don't have like really great low owned plays in general. I guess that changes a little bit if we do have Sterling Shepard at 11%. I do have a lot of interest in that, but just generally, I was looking for like who are the low owned. I do a write up on who are my favorite low owned plays on the slate, and it's thin, like under 10%. You don't really have anybody. Sterling Shepard, close enough, but it is like there's not anybody that's like, oh, this guy has a real role on the team, should see opportunities, who's not getting, at least generally like 20% ownership.
Yeah.
Shepard kind of the exception here.
The
Which makes me
only
a little bit
player
more.
that I have projected for less than 10% flex ownership that I have with a more than 1% chance of being optimal is Cameron Johnson.
Yeah.
At 2%.
So there you go. Yep. So yeah, I like the play as just a contrarian, like you said, just like very boom bust, could be an absolute zero, could have a long play. He is, has shown that splash play potential. I think he was pretty good in the preseason, just based on little like headlines that I read. So maybe Cameron Johnson, you can make the case for it. Speedy rookie, probably the best sub 10% owned play, unless, I mean, Sterling Shepard at 11%. Like, I like that better. Like he's going to be out on the field a good amount. If I can get Sterling Shepard at 11%, I'm pretty interested in that. But yeah, not like a absolute smash play, but I would probably be more inclined to play Sterling Shepard, but I do like Cameron Johnson. Cody Thompson to me is probably going to be called up from the practice squad. I would guess he plays behind Cameron Johnson. He is a veteran, so maybe he does come up and immediately play ahead of Cameron Johnson. I think both are in play, but I would probably be more inclined to play Cameron Johnson for his kind of spike week upside. Any other notes on Tampa receivers?
No.
Okay. And Falcons receivers, we of course have Drake London, best projected of the group. He is 8,800. We have him in the captain spot. Let's see, 12% of the time. In the flex, Drake London at 40% of the time. So good amount of ownership going to Drake London. Pretty clear wide receiver one on the team. Second in route participation, does have 31 targets on the year, leads the team in that metric. How are you feeling about Drake London today?
Good. Like you said, leads the team in targets, 0.28 targets per route run. McLeod second at 0.22, Robinson 0.21, Mooney 0.2. So nice gap there. Obviously involved on pretty much every play. I had mentioned it earlier that he is showing up as the optimal captain, second most often for me behind Bijan at about 14%, projects for about 13 to 14% ownership. So not going wildly under owned, but I do think that there's, a little bit of an edge there on a player level. And the salary is just pretty nice too. At only 8,800, 1,200 less than Godwin, 1,400 less than Evans is nice, 1,000 less than Robinson. So as far as the top end guys go, I think he offers the most value, which is nice in addition to, being one of the highest projected guys.
Yep. And I can pull up, let's see, where is Tampa in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed? They've been kind of tough against wide receivers in general across the board. Looks like they are, bottom 10 in terms of matchups you want for your receivers. So a little bit of a tough matchup for for Drake London. But he's done okay against in some tough matchups. Did okay against Kansas City. Hasn't really had like the blow up game so far, but clearly has that potential. And you can only play from these two teams. So yeah, I think Drake London looks like a really, really strong option here. I don't know that I'm taking any kind of stand on Drake London. He's not like none of the numbers stand out to me as like I need to get above that or I'm gonna fade that. Sounds like to you, captain would be the spot. Is it mostly you think you're gonna have more than the field at captain, or do you also think you're gonna have more in the flex?
I'll probably have a lot at flex too.
Okay.
Like I have him going slightly under or slightly over owned at flex, but nothing too crazy. I have Godwin being more over owned than London, for example, which again, I think Godwin is a good play. I'm not saying that he isn't, but factoring in salary and everything, they project very similarly, and London is just cheaper. So at similar ownership. So I'm just going to prefer London there for those reasons. So I assume I just end up with a lot of Drake London, whether it's in flex or captain.
Darnell Mooney now up to 7,200, projects for 11.5 fantasy points here. Very clearly, really, really strong role. Leads the team in route participation, 90.5% route participation for Darnell Mooney. Second in targets with 23. Hard to argue with the role for Darnell Mooney. I guess the one thing you would note is Ray McLeod has just one fewer target on the season than Darnell Mooney. The route participation more even since week one. So man, it's tough to want to prioritize Darnell Mooney over Ray McLeod. What are the ADOTs? We have Ray McLeod is 7.9. Actually, not as big of a differential as I would have thought. I would have thought Mooney would have an even bigger gap here than we're seeing. But how are you feeling about? I guess we can group them together if you want. Break it down however you want. Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod.
So Mooney, I think, is just kind of whatever at 7,200. I think he's priced pretty correctly. Projected for 25% flex ownership, 5% captain ownership on DraftKings. Shows up optimal in the flex spot like 27% of the time for me. About 6% at captain. So maybe slightly underowned. But like you said, the fact that he just hasn't to this point earned a ton of targets is somewhat concerning. I do think it's important, we mentioned it before, but keep in mind that, obviously it's only a 4-game sample anyway, but in Atlanta's case, it's kind of a 3-game sample because week 1 was just such an absurd anomaly of a target distribution game where Ray McCloud was, the clear number 1 and Drake London and Darnell Mooney were basically like not involved. Yeah. So that's going to skew the numbers a little bit too. So, obviously, like I do expect Mooney to earn more targets than McCloud over the rest of the season. But, I think he's pretty much correctly priced, maybe going a little bit underowned. McCloud, I mentioned before, I think is the most underowned player on the slate if we assume that the 30% ownership is true, which I don't really think that it is. But, even if that ends up coming up to like 35%, I think it's fine. He's showing up as optimal in the flex. Almost 39% of the time for me. Only 3% at captain. Obviously he's somebody that's less likely to put up a huge game in terms of raw fantasy points, but he's just very obviously mispriced at $3,400 for somebody that's running routes on almost every drop back he's earned so far. And again, this is not likely to continue because it's factoring in week 1, but he has the most targets per route run outside of Drake London on this team right now. If I remove week 1, I guess I could see how that looks. Obviously you don't want to just totally remove it, but right. Just out of curiosity in weeks 2 through 4.
While you're looking that up, I'll just show you the raw numbers here. Darnell Mooney just 3 targets in week 1, but in the 3 weeks since then, 6, 8, and 6 targets. So actually being pretty involved since week 1. Ray McCloud 7 targets in week 1. Actually has still held on to a pretty good role since then. 5 targets in week 2, 3 in week 3, and then 7 in week 4. So continues to be pretty involved. But the 7 in week 4, not the same outlier as it was in week 1, where just the team, there weren't that many targets and he saw 7.
Right. Yeah, if you look, so since week 2, Drake London blowing everybody out of the water, 0.32 targets per route run. Mooney is second at 0.22, Robinson third at 0.2, McCloud still fourth at 0.18, slightly ahead of Algiers 0.17 and Pitts 0.16. So since week 2, it's more of like the target distribution that you expect. Drake London running away from everybody. Ray McCloud, fourth, but not that far behind. Mooney and Robinson, obviously, Pitts being the part that maybe you didn't expect. But, also not like he's grading out very well in metrics. No. He might just be bad. But, for McCloud, I think what we've seen since week 2 is a lot more sustainable than anything we saw in week 1. But at 3,400, like, it's still really, really good.
Really good role, yeah, for a 34. Yeah, I don't know how he's still 3,400. I would have thought for sure they would have priced him up a little bit more than this by now.
Like the fact that they so quickly got Bucky Irving to 6,400, but then just forgot about Ray McCloud is crazy.
Yeah, Rotogranus has him projected for 31% ownership. Darnell Mooney at 27%. Feels like that gap should be bigger just given the price tags there. Here's that captain. We have Ray McCloud at 5.5% captain ownership, Darnell Mooney at 5%. So yeah, again, I would expect that gap to be bigger than it is on both of them. I do think both are, very in play. Like I think you said it right. Darnell Mooney is just kind of a neutral play for me, not somebody I'm taking a major stand on. He does have the larger ADOT than Ray McCloud. I think more likely to just like have that one play where he busts off for a long touchdown, whereas Ray McCloud I don't think is as likely as Darnell Mooney to do that. So I think he's fine, just not like a huge priority for me at 7,200. Whereas Ray McCloud, just looks like he's too cheap. The field is not really taking advantage of that price tag maybe as much as you would expect. So it looks pretty good. Any other notes on any wide receivers? You getting any Kadarius Hodge? Anybody else?
Not really getting the Hodge. I did want to check. Yeah, so Darnell Mooney, captain. Like Mooney is kind of the Mike Evans here, where in lineups where Mooney is the optimal captain, Kirk Cousins shows up like 88% of the time. In lineups where London is the optimal captain, Cousins shows up like 78% of the time. So still, obviously, Cousins with either of them, but it does, make sense, just like it did with Tampa Bay, where if Mooney is the captain, you're much more likely to need Cousins even than if London's the captain.
Yeah, because if Mooney is the optimal captain, it probably means he's got a lot of yards and a touchdown, as
Right.
opposed to like 9 receptions or something like that, where it's just a
Right.
total
And
PPR
also
scam.
he's just a little bit cheaper too. So
Yeah,
it also just opens the door for, you know, does Cousins score more raw points than Bucky Irving or something?
right.
So.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to tight ends then, and I'm doing a better job with the banners than usual. I'm actually updating the side graphic. There we go. Tight ends. Now I'll move it over to tight ends here. K Dotton, man, RIP Kyle Pitts. K Dotton projecting better than Kyle Pitts on fantasy points. I'm curious if that is also the case at Roto Grinders.
I have them the same, which still is just wild.
Roto Grinders does not have. It has Kyle Pitts at 13.8, which and K Dotton at 8.8. I'm guessing that's going to be updated at some point today because that feels
I think
a
there's
little
some
bit.
wish casting on Kyle Pitts going on there.
There might be some wish casting on Kyle Pitts going on there. Yeah, I think the even projections probably more close to accurate. Still, even with this mega high projection here, just 20% projected ownership on Kyle Pitts.
I mean, if you use that projection and he's 20% owned, he's the best play on the slate, probably.
Yeah, exactly. I would be jamming Kyle Pitts. The role has not been that awesome for Kyle Pitts. I guess I can pull that up here. Kyle Pitts is fourth on the team, 67.5% route participation, 13 targets on the season. I feel like less dead than Mark Andrews feels like right now, I guess. So that he has that going for him. But in general, man, just not great so far this year. What is your level of interest in Kyle Pitts?
I mean, it's still there just because, like, theoretically he is talented and, you know, he is only 5,600, but there's nothing that I can point to that gives me reason for optimism. Like, he's not earning targets. We just talked about that. He's getting less targets per route run than the backup running back on the Falcons. He isn't like, I don't have it in front of me. You might be able to get to it quicker than me, but somebody had tweeted out that he was like worst in separation score amongst like all tight ends that are primary tight ends. So it's not like you can even look at it and say, you know, well, he's getting open. Cousins just isn't looking for him or something. You know, somebody in chat just said that Cousins had said that he wants to throw the ball to Pitts more. I have an easier time buying into something like that if we have, you know, tape of Pitts being open and not getting the ball, or we have stats and metrics telling us that Pitts is getting open. But that, you know, if he's not getting open, like, yeah, I would like to throw him the ball more too. I would like him to get open, but he's not.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, he's 5,600. He still clearly has the primary tight end role on this team. So on a showdown slate, I think he's fine. I do think he's actually maybe going a little bit under owned at flex, projected for 14% ownership. I think he's optimal about 16% of the time. But this to me is just very much it's a showdown slate. Weird stuff happens. Obviously, you should be playing some Kyle Pitts, assuming you're playing, you know, multiple lineups. But there's nothing I can point to say that I think Kyle Pitts does well.
This is interesting. So, with the minimum of 75 routes run, limited to just tight ends, Brock Bowers has a 0 separation score. I feel like I saw Scott said something about the reason for this is he just has not run them. I forget what the reason was exactly, but Kyle Pitts in the bottom sixth worst separation score for tight ends, minimum 75 routes so far this year. So yeah, not looking good from a separation standpoint for Kyle Pitts. Yeah, I think to me, 20% projected ownership seems kind of fine on Kyle Pitts. What is does Saber have something similar?
I'm not sure what Saber has. I know I have it at 14.
Okay. 14% projected.
Yeah,
ownership.
which I think is a little bit low. Like, I think he probably comes in probably slightly higher than that. Like, I would say between 15 and 20 is probably where Pitts ends up.
Yeah, I think, and I'm just looking kind of around the industry a little bit. Yeah, that seems to be kind of the general range, which to me is fine. It's still, sadly, that's still not like a smash spot where I want to be playing a ton of Kyle Pitts. I think it's a spot where I think I'm probably just going to try to match the field around probably 20% is probably what I'm shooting for Pitts. So maybe I end up.
I'm not sure.
You're frozen?
No, okay, you're back. You were frozen on my screen, but I don't know if it was me or you was the issue.
Oh, okay. I was not. Could you hear me or no?
No, you were just quiet and stuck.
Oh shoot. Okay. Yeah, I was just saying, like, I'm probably shooting for around 20% Kyle Pitts,
Yeah, I think that's fine.
which, that maybe that comes in above weight to the field, maybe not. I don't know what we can count on here.
And I mean, like, it's a pricing thing. Like, you can analyze players and everything all you want, but you still have a limited pool of guys to choose from. You have salaries that matter. At the end of the day, you don't necessarily, especially when you're talking about flex, it's not even, is this the game where Kyle Pitts smashes? It's more the actual question is like,
I don't know where Adam just went. Adam just dropped out real quick there. He's not even in the studio anymore. So something happened there. I'll bring Adam back in as soon as I can. I was, of course, not listening to what he was saying. Never am. Never listening to Adam. No, just kidding. But I don't really know what he was saying there because I was working on other stuff. I will just say, okay, he is coming back here now. I was just telling chat that I was not really listening that closely to you, so I couldn't expound on your thought there from when you dropped out. Do you want to finish your thought?
yeah, I was just saying that, like, when you're talking about him at flex, the actual question kind of is just, does he beat the kickers and defenses and Tyler Algier and Bucky Irving more so than, like, does he have a great game?
Exactly. It's all relative to whatever else we have on the slate. I think 20% seems about fair. I did pull up schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Both Atlanta and Tampa Bay have been top 11 or so in limiting tight ends so far this year. So it has not been a great matchup for tight ends on either of these teams. But again, small, the prices are good enough that I don't care that much. They don't need to have like blow up games. So I think I'm okay with it. Are you playing any Charlie Warner?
Probably not much. He's, as far as the sub 1K, low owned guys, he looks like the second best play to me behind Cameron Johnson. I haven't projected for like a fantasy point, but obviously not likely to really do much. Shows up optimal less than 1% of the time for me, but he's in the lottery. If you're playing a bunch of lineups, he's at least somebody that makes sense to have a little bit of.
He had 2 targets in week 1, no targets since then, a total of 14 routes on the year. Just a like backup tight end. If he scores a touchdown, you'll want him. Otherwise, he probably won't. One of those standard backup tight end plays. I did want to, somebody was saying this in chat, and it's true. Kyle Pitts' route participation has gone down every single week this year. Started at 78.6% route participation, 71% in week 2, down to 64.5% week 3, 58.3% week 4. So not a great trend for Kyle Pitts. Yeah. Early on,
it goes back to what we were saying like before. Like, you can like think Kyle Pitts is good or whatever, but everything points to him just not being good. The coaching staff is using him less. He's not drawing targets. Like, every metric and everything that you would point to make the argument that like this guy is going to do better doesn't exist for Kyle Pitts.
Right. Yeah. You can still play him. Like we said, you can still play him because it's a showdown slate. He's not that expensive, but yeah, not a lot going for him. Back to let's talk about Kate Otten a little bit, and I'll pull up the route participation here for Kate Otten. Look at those numbers. Again, not a great matchup for tight ends in general, but Kate Otten has been 69.5% route participation, third on the team, 20 targets on the year. So he's been pretty involved in this offense, and he's only 4,000. What's your level of interest in Kate Otten?
Yeah, I think he looks fine. There are some more targets probably available with Palmer and McMillan being out. Clearly, Godwin and Evans are still going to dominate them, but 4K is a good price tag too. He's 1,600 less than Pitts, and like we were saying before, projects very, very similarly. So projected for around 22% ownership, showing up optimal for me around 19% of the time in flex, around 2% of the time the captain. So I think good value play, probably a little bit over-owned, but also not by any crazy margin or anything. I think he looks like one of the better values on the slate. He would look a lot better and be a lot more popular if Ray McLeod was like 5,800 like he should be. But,
yeah.
McLeod will keep Otten's ownership and optimal percentage in check. But outside of McLeod, looks like a very good point per dollar projection.
Yep. And it looks like the ownership projection is pretty similar at RotoGrinders. Is also under 25%, over 20%. All seems pretty fine. I agree with you. One of the better values on the slate. We have a few. Ray McLeod is the obvious one. Kate Otten pretty good. I think Sterling Shepard a pretty solid value option as well as a wide receiver 3. So we do have some value options. They're just all getting some ownership. I'm not taking any huge stand there either. Are you playing any Payne Durham?
Probably not. I mean, he basically looks the same as like Charlie Warner to me, except he's a little bit more expensive. So,
Yep.
like, if you're playing a bunch of lineups in the lotto, yeah, maybe. I mean, I didn't even know who Austin Barner was until he scored a touchdown on Monday.
Yep.
But outside of that, I don't care.
Played all 4 games, has run 11 routes on the season, so it is I think, yeah, spot on. Like Charlie Warner, probably slightly better, but it really just comes down to if he gets in the end zone, you want him. No, and he's also 1,200, so not even as cheap as I think Charlie Warner was. Am I right? Wasn't Charlie Warner? Let me pull that up. 800. Okay, and Payne Durham 1,200. So yeah, just I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'd rather play Charlie Warner. Probably not playing either of them. Both in play if you're playing 150. Not a huge stand there.
I'd rather play Cameron Johnson than both, but they're all the
too.
same play basically. Where if you're playing small field stuff, I don't think you need to even consider them. If you're playing large field stuff and you're playing limited lineups, you probably still don't need to consider them. If you're playing a lot of lineups, any of those guys can just kind of sneak in as the what if something really weird happens type guy.
Yeah. Kareem, I'm pretty sure he was just talking about like the price range that Pitts is in. Was there anything more to it? Just you were saying like he needs to beat out this group of players. So
I was saying how just it all comes back to price, where you have a limited player pool, and especially when you're talking about him at flex, where you're not necessarily talking about him having the huge blow up game. He can be optimal by just having a completely mediocre game if the kickers, defenses, guys priced around him don't do anything.
All right, we'll move on from tight ends to defenses, kickers. Any thoughts on defenses, kickers?
No. Yeah, no.
I'll pull up the ownership here.
What'd you say?
I said I'll pull up the ownership here.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Falcons are showing up a little bit better for me. 18% chance of being optimal for the Falcons, 10% for the Bucs. So that is a pretty decent sized gap. Falcons are also more expensive though. They're projected to be a little bit more popular, but I do think the Falcons are going a little bit under-owned right now. But yeah, there's no. I never really have in-depth defense thoughts.
I don't either. Defense kickers, it is so hard to predict. Usually coming in under-owned. Interesting that both are coming in pretty low in your optimal rates. So you said 10% for the Bucs, 18% for the Falcons. I was going to say these seem like low ownership numbers on both of them that I would probably lean into at the price. But yeah, if they're coming in even lower in terms of optimal, I don't know. I'll probably try to match the field. I don't think I'm going to be taking any major stand here. Kickers similarly, Younghoe Koo, 17%. I kind of like 17% ownership for Koo. Not taking any major stands. So I think we can close it there. Do you have any other final thoughts on the slate?
No, I think it actually should be a pretty fun one. It's nice to move on from Miami and Tennessee.
God, that game was, worked out for you. The night worked out for you. Okay. But that particular, like the way I played it was just so wrong. And it was, I still think it was made sense logically to lean into Snoop Huntley and Will Levis, but man, that did not go well. And you could tell a quarter into the game, it was like, yeah, Snoop Huntley is not just going to thrive with Mike McDaniel and Tyreek Hill. It's just like, it made sense logically that maybe with these talent, I think it made sense. Maybe it didn't even, but man, it was pretty clear pretty early that was just not going to be a thing. Kind of saved by the rushing touchdown.
Right. Yeah. Like he still was okay, but it was bad.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for this show. I will be back tonight, 90 minutes prior to lock. Approximately going to wait for inactives to come out. Then I will go live for another hour talking about the slate. When we have inactives news, we'll know if Cody Thompson, Thompson Johnson, I'm messing up their names, but we'll know if he is up from the practice squad at that point. We'll have all the inactives and stuff. So if you want to join me then, I'll be going live again. Adam, what do you have coming up?
Nothing on the YouTube channel or anything. I will have my Showdown data for Endgame subs and Dub Club subs posted later.
And you can find those links are both in the description of this video if you want to sign up for Adam's Dub Club or sign up for Endgame Syndicate. And when you sign up for Endgame Syndicate, you also get access to your Dub Club. Is that right?
Yeah. The stuff that I put out for Dub Club is included at Endgame. You just also get access to, you know, the Yuta videos, Brick videos, Nerdy Tenor videos, all that other stuff. And then I just add on my content.
Right on. Yeah. So check that out. If you have not already done so, make sure you are subscribed to both of our YouTube channels. We are trying to grow our channels right now. Pretty new channels. And I'll be back tonight. You can also find my Showdown breakdown if you want a full breakdown of the slate on at Fantasy Points. It is available there. Thanks, Adam. Thank you all for hanging out with us throughout this, and good luck tonight.